Okay, great. So yes, thank you again for being here today. Before we start with the questions, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Austin Douillard. I'm really just a human being, but yeah, I've been educated in politics for quite some time now. I studied as an undergraduate student in politics at Ithaca College rather, in upstate New York, and then I wanted to continue my studies in critical IR, but I quickly found out that I needed to leave the United States in order to do that because critical IR programs are sort of few and far between. So I ended up going to the UK to study, to continue my studies, and I got one master's degree in critical international politics there. And I got another master's degree in post colonial politics as well. And um, yeah, so that's always been kind of close to my heart. A global political economy is really where my interests lie, and that's what I'm sort of most passionate about. But then afterwards, I moved back to New York and I got another master's degree in education and became a classroom teacher. So that's also a big passion of mine. That's kind of how I see myself, and that's sort of who I am as a teacher first and foremost. I spent a lot of time studying how people will ascertain information and take it on board, and also reject information. And I think that that experience is certainly something that's related to Israel and Palestine because there's definitely a lot of emotional resistance to learning, a desire not to know. So that's always kind of on my mind. But beyond that, I run a thing called Radical Ideas. It's sort of a social media thing at this point, but I produce some content that I think is relevant to not just Israel and Palestine, but also some of my other interests regarding capitalism, communism, anarchism, and I think we're probably going to get into some of that today. So, yeah, maybe that can suffice by way of introduction.
Thank you. So you mentioned that because of your background in global economy and global geopolitics, and I guess also post-colonialism, that's how you started looking at Israel and Palestine. Can you get a bit more in into details for this, like how you started looking at the situation in Palestine, and specifically how did you start talking about it in the content you produce, but also if you do that as well as a teacher?
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, like I said, my focus is really political economy. I kind of wish I could talk about that all day, but in a way I am. I think what happened after October 7th was such a major punctuation point in the history of empire, of the United States hegemony. And it just became such a pivotal issue that it seems like it's important to go full steam ahead on talking about that and centering that because, yeah, it's just quite a central thing. I mean, it's a turning point as far as I can see. And the other thing, I mean, on a personal level, after that, man, after that event, I saw a lot of my friends who are in the alternative community or maybe festival goers, and some of them were were Israelis, like the individuals that went to the Nova music festival around October 7th, and yeah, I saw a pretty hard right turn with a lot of people in that crowd that I was involved with move to the right, or end up posting things um, justifying Israeli occupation and Israeli war crimes. So yeah, I definitely lost some friends there, and it was kind of a shock to me, kind of in a similar way that there was a shock during COVID, where I saw a lot of people kind of move to the right. The person that's been talking a lot about this is Naomi Klein. I think she writes books once every however many years about some major pivotal shift going on from like, she wrote about the shock doctrine. She wrote about COVID. Her recent book, Doppelganger, is exactly this trend of the shock of COVID, I think, moving people to the right or confusing people or, yeah, it's a really disturbing thing. And I kind of witnessed that in a lot of people that I was close to. yeah, start defending Zionism kind of out of the blue. And so there's a personal level to me, I think, just to put that out there. Maybe Naomi Klein will write a book in 5 years about Zionism or something.
Thank you. So, I mean, that's really something that I think a lot of us can relate to, unfortunately. So thank you for sharing this. Um, I would like to ask you a bit more about your perspective when it comes to Marxism and capitalism, because of the content that you share. I mean, I hope that I'm not misinterpreting, but I understand that you relate a lot with Marxism. If this is the case, can you share your perspective from this point of view on the situation in Palestine?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Yeah, it's true that I've been working very closely with Marxism for the last few years. I've been developing an online course to that effect, which is mostly for me, I think, to collect my thoughts, but it's exploded into quite a deep and, to my mind, pretty authoritative explanation and explication of Marxism. So yeah, I'm definitely a part of an academic tradition that takes Marx's dialectical method and uses it against Marx or critiques Marx through the scope of dialectics. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from, is dialectics first and foremost. Well, what's dialectics? Dialectics is the study of totalities. One of the laws of dialectics is called the interpenetration of opposites, and that's about seeing how things are what they are not. They're constituted by what's outside them. It's called the constitutive outside. So to understand one aspect of an issue, or to understand one thing, you kind of have to understand all the other parts of the issue, or all the things that it's not, to see how it's situated, to see how these parts interrelate, without ever reducing an issue to one singular cause or to just one dimension of that thing. So for example, I see a lot of people who want to reduce the Israel problem to money, or to the Israel lobby, or to Holocaust guilt, or to Zionist brainwashing, or natural resource extraction. But dialecticians really try to hold all of these different pieces together to get a sort of holistic view of what's happening, and not reducing this I mean, it is a complex problem. I know we like to say that Israel is not a complex problem, and there's a degree to which that's true. It's, there's a simplicity to it when you see the asymmetry of power relations. It's quite simple on a level, but on the other hand, there is a long history and there are a lot of moving parts here, and so we have to appreciate that. At least that's what dialecticians try to do. So that's a word about dialectics, but I should really talk about what Marxism is in international relations theory, because that's a bit of my background. And like a good dialectician, I should probably try to explain Marxism through explaining what it's not. So maybe I could give you a rundown of 3 different theories in IR, or worldviews in IR, and contextualize Marxism that way. And these would be liberalism, realism, and Marxism. So I'll go into it a bit. Liberalism is an idea in international relations theory that's working under something called democratic peace theory, which is the idea that democracies don't go to war against each other. And the liberals have all kinds of empirical evidence to show that this is true. So democracies tend not to go to war against each other. And so liberal democracies, or people or groups working under the scope of liberalism, try to create democracies all over the place that are friendly to the United States particularly. I mean, the US is sort of the liberal country par excellence in this way. So it sounds all right? Creating democracies, we like democracies, it sounds pretty benign. Well, the legacy of the neoconservative movement, which tried to remake the Middle East after 9/11, kind of really reveals how murderous and criminal of an idea liberalism can really be. So the Biden administration is kind of a continuation of this liberal campaign to dominate the world, to remake the world in its own image. And so I think this is really the legacy of liberalism in international relations. It's about democracy promotion, but the underhand of that is really imperialism. Yeah, so Israel's definitely fits right in with that history of liberal democracy creation. Okay, so that's liberalism. What about realism? Realism is an ideology that's favored by John Mearsheimer. He's been speaking out about Israel quite a lot, and I think he has a lot of great things to say about this issue. But yeah, his approach, realism, let me just explain it. First of all, one dimension to this is that realists see states as the main actors in international politics. And those states exist independently in a situation of international anarchy. And all that means is that there's no meta state. There's no state above that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force and can therefore solve conflicts and instill order in the international system. Fundamentally, realists say that it's an anarchic system that we've got. Yeah, so, and the UN doesn't count as this, by the way. I think a lot of people say, well, what about the UN? Well, I mean, just take an example about Israel's recent attacks on UN forces, and you kind of realize that we really do live in an anarchic system and there is no meta state. So that's the second part of realism. But the third part of realism is that no state knows what any other state is going to do. So states can't trust each other to follow treaties or to do anything else within a realist framework. They call it the black box. Inside every state is the black box of the unknown. You never know when your neighbor is going to attack. So it's an unstable anarchic system here. And because no state can fully trust each other and they're all trying to stay safe, the best thing to do, obviously, is to take over as much as possible, to become as powerful as possible, to build up your military as much as possible. And yeah, I think there's a degree to which a realist framework could be applicable to Israel and Palestine, but there is one problem with this framework when it comes to Israel and Palestine, which is that this realism is a way of understanding states, states in an international framework, but that's not the case. That's not applicable when it comes to Palestine. Palestine is not a state. It's an occupied territory. As much as we would like to see a Palestinian state, that's not what we see here. So there is really a hard limit with regard to what realism can really say about the international system. So enter Marxism, right? And Marxism has a lot to say about the desires of states, the motivations of states, because the focus of Marxism is economics. Marxists see states as basically the political military wing of the capitalist class. States are a sort of expression of capitalist interests. So yeah, they tend to focus on looking to economic issues to explain what states do. And I think that there are a lot of economic issues, which I hope we get into a little bit later on, regarding these economic forces that drive Israel to do what it's doing. And this actually furnishes us with the key to a viable strategy with which to attack Zionists where it hurts, to hurt them, where they're most sensitive, which would be their wallets, right? The economic issue. And the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, has really been great in exemplifying different strategies that we could take to make it unprofitable to oppress Palestinians. As crass as that sounds, I think that's really an important critical strategy. Yeah, because if it's not profitable to do it, then simply put, people won't do it. So another key here is to ban arms sales to Israel. I know that there was a motion put in front of the U.S. Congress that recently got voted down to ban arms sales to Israel, but it was one of the most popular. That movement, I think, got more votes than it ever had. So I think that, I don't know, there's a glimmer of hope there, I guess. Yeah, let me just take a sip of water here. I could talk more about dialectics, but give me a second. Yeah, maybe I could just say one more word about dialectics, I guess, and then we can move on to something else, which is there's another law in dialectics called the negation of the negation. And I think this form of dialectics has gone under a little bit of criticism because it's a bit formulaic. And I think one of the things about dialectics is that it sort of tends to resist all hard formulas. But this is basically a formula of change and how change happens. So I think there's something to it. And people used to think, well, I think a lot of people think about this law of dialectics as like thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Like there's something, the thesis, and then the opposite of that thing, the antithesis or the counter argument. And then there's some sort of happy mix of those two things, which is the synthesis. Well, that's not the framework that comes out of the Marxist tradition or the tradition before Marxism, which is the like Hegelian tradition. The framework that he uses is different. It goes affirmation, negation, and the negation of the negation. Well, why is that important? Well, one of the things to highlight about that difference is that with the thesis antithesis idea, the antithesis is sort of is seen as coming from the outside. Yeah, but with the affirmation and negation of the negation, the idea is that it's an internal movement, that within whatever thing we're talking about, there are contradictory forces within that emerge, and they end up operating imminently from the inside. And the person that really talks a lot about this, if you want to read more about this, is Todd McGowan. But anyway, how does this apply to Israel and Palestine? Well, I'll just share with you how I've been processing this and thinking about this, which is that I think of Israel's ethnocentrism, and Israel is an ethnocentric state. I mean, take a cursory glance at the flag or its basic laws. I mean, it doesn't have a constitution, but it's got what's called basic laws. And since 2018, it's very clear that Israel is a homeland for Jews and only Jews. It's a unique homeland for Jews. So yeah, it's an ethnocentric state for sure. It's not a pluralist state. There's no justification for thinking that. It's an explicitly racist state, at least according to Avi Schleim. When he talks about this, he says this is an explicit example of racism. So that would be the affirmation for me. Well, the negation of that, I think, is something that emerges out of it, actually. It's a sort of reactionary ethnocentrism of Hamas. That's kind of how I've been thinking about Hamas, is a sort of similarly, but like at the same time, opposite, like equal and opposite form of ethnocentrism. Now, we know that Hamas's charter, its most recent charter, explicitly is pluralist. Actually, it's calling for a pluralist situation across all of Palestine, and that's true. I think there's at least nominally with their words, they're calling for a kind of pluralism, where Israel's nominally not calling for a kind of pluralism, and so there's a big difference there. But nonetheless, I think Hamas is an Islamic organization. I mean, that's sort of what it is, and so its claims to be fully pluralist it's not a secular, it's not a secular organization. So in some ways, I think about it as a negation. And the other way I think about it as a negation and not just an antithesis is that in some ways it emerges as a necessary thing coming out of Israel. Israel, we know, has funded Hamas throughout a lot of its history. Why has it done that? Because Israel needs some kind of organization like Hamas to point the finger at, right? To blame and say, look at all this violence that's happening. It's their fault. And that's why this two-state peace process has failed again and again and again. Right? They sort of need a scapegoat, and that's through that necessity, that internal necessity, Hamas has emerged. So what's the negation of the negation? Well, I think hopefully by this point it should be pretty obvious that the negation of the negation is no ethnocentrism at all, right? And that's where the One Democratic State initiative, I think, is so valuable, is because it really is the resolution of this ethnocentric mistake. Yeah, so I don't know, there's a bit of a dialectic there for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these different frameworks. On the question of ethnocentrism, I will come back to this a bit later, but before I wanted to discuss a bit more around the relation between, or the Marxist framework in the analysis of the Palestinian situation. What role do you see global capitalism play in the occupation and in the colonization of Palestine?
Yeah, okay. Well, I think what we could do is we could trace the profit motive and how that plays out in a variety of ways, in a variety of fields, that makes it in certain people's interests to create and to perpetuate crimes against humanity and genocide. So there's four examples that come to mind, and I can run through them. We know that capitalists like it when workers have very little choice to do anything but accept low wages. As of 2023, there were 150 to 200,000 Palestinian workers in Israel. And that means they have to cross the series of humiliating checkpoints, and if they dare try to organize or negotiate for higher wages, then they can have their permits revoked immediately or be condemned to try to survive in the West Bank or in Gaza, in those besieged territories. So their employability is extremely insecure and precarious, and we could kind of call them a colonial precariat. Their workforce is unstable, insecure. So Israeli capitalists really benefit from cheap Palestinian labor, put simply. After October 7th, though, Palestinians were barred from working in Israel. Everyone lost their jobs. And as far as I know, right now, there's been about 10,000 workers who have been allowed back in Israel under even tighter security measures. So I don't know what the future holds for those workers, but that would be one dimension, right? Cheap Palestinian labor is sort of nice for Israelis. Take another example, though. There's been plans for what's called the Ben Gurion Canal, which would cut right through Gaza and save Israelis and Americans millions, because they wouldn't have to use the Egypt-controlled Suez Canal, and they have to pay taxes on that every time they use it. So if they could make their own canal, that would really save them a lot of money. Well, there's only one problem with that. That problem is that the plans for the Ben Gurion Canal go right through Gaza. So there's a profit incentive to take over Gaza. And I think this goes part of the way towards explaining, why the violence is happening the way that it is. We could take another example, and a third example, which is that in 2019, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the UNCTAD, estimated the net value of the Gaza marine natural gas at $4.5 billion. Well, that's a pretty significant natural resource that's in Gaza. And if only the Israelis took over Gaza and could control that natural resource, then they would have access to it. And I think that also partly explains some of the profit incentive for the violence. Not to mention a fourth issue, which is that there's a whole real estate movement happening in Israel right now, where people are prospecting and eyeing out real estate in Gaza. That's some nice beachfront real estate. I mean, I'm sorry to speak about it in such a crass way, but it may sound cynical for me to talk about it like this, but I think that there is cynicism at play here at work, and I've got to describe it. So yeah, that would be four issues. But I mean, maybe I should go right into talking about a sort of fifth and quite major issue that I think it's really impossible to understand without talking about, which is the military-industrial complex. Israel supplies at least 2% of the world's military equipment, which is obviously disproportionately large considering Israel's population. And there's three main military contractors that are responsible for this. There's Elbit Systems, Israel Aerospace Companies, and Rafael. And they're in the world's top 100 arms producers. And there's about 150 arms companies operating in Israel right now. And this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And they've got a vested interest in continuing conflicts. And you better believe they have an impact on policy. This is multi-billions of dollars we're talking about. So yeah, they have an influence in perpetuating conflict. Any kind of a peace deal or a ceasefire or whatever is pretty much anathema to the profit incentive, at least in this industry, if not the others I mentioned. So let me talk a little bit more about this. I mean, I've got some notes here. The main military exporters to Israel are the United States. They supply 69% of arms to Israel. Germany sells and makes profit off of 30% of Israel's weapons and the foreign arms sales to Israel. And Italy is 0.9%. And then there's the UK, France, and Spain contributing in minor ways. So that's the United States mostly and Germany mostly. And that means that they're all complicit in the crimes against humanity and genocide that Israel is perpetuating. Because if you give somebody the gun again and again and again to commit more and more crimes, I'm sorry, but yeah, you're I was going to say your head should be on the chopping block, but maybe that's too violent or whatever. And I don't want to incite violence, but I mean, whatever. You're responsible. Yeah, you're culpable if you're doing that. One of the last things to say about the military and industrial complex on this issue is that this is so sick to say this, but if those weapons are used in the field, then the weapons that you are selling can be marketed as battle tested, which is like a nice stamp of approval. Like, look, this is really working. Okay, so when all of these Israeli created weapons or weapons tested in this conflict, in this genocide, in these crimes, then yeah, you can say, oh, look, it's battle tested, but really we could translate that to these weapons are used on starving Palestinian children, and that's a fact. That's just a fact. So all this would go away. All this money to be made would go away if there was peace in the region. So I think this helps explain things.
Thank you. Yes, that's like a broad picture of different ways in which, as you're saying, money would go away or these benefits would go away with peace. So another aspect which is a bit less on to the more cynical and dramatic aspects of this, but looking more at Marxism within one Palestinian democratic state. How do you see the class struggles within the Palestinian society in this context, and how class means for Palestine, especially if we take into account also diaspora or refugee and the refugees?
Nice. Well, what comes to mind, something that I can talk about within the scope of Marxism and how it can help us deal with these issues of identity politics, is that, well, let me introduce two bits of Marxist jargon that I think can frame this discussion or help us frame this discussion, which is base and superstructure. So the base is the economic foundation of our lives, and it's foundational because it's sort of the sine qua non of every society, without which it is not. If you have a society that doesn't have an economic foundation, is not meeting people's needs, then it's not going to exist. So in that sense, it's foundational. Well, what's the superstructure? The superstructure is Marx's term for the ideological and religious and political frameworks that are at play. And one of the things he says, as maybe a dialectical materialist, is that the base is foundational, and it kind of creates this ideological superstructure, and identity politics fits into this, right? Religious identity is one of these aspects of superstructure, in the same way that Zionist identity or Israeli identity fits into this superstructure. And Marx's point is that the base will create a superstructure that can then dialectically fold back and support it. And I think that there's a critique to be had here, which I think, or a misunderstanding of what Marx was doing, which is the technological determinist kind of misreading of this, which is that the economic base is developing, technology is increasing kind of on its own, and the ideological superstructures are just kind of like tagging along in the back and being created by this in a kind of passive way. And that's not really what Marx was doing. That's not really a dialectical point of view. I think what dialectics is going to teach us is that all of these different dimensions interrelate, and you have to look at each different issue and see which dimension is kind of coming to the fore. So I think dialectics helps us be a little bit more flexible than just say this is like a, I don't know, like a technological determinist thing where ideas or identities are mere products of the economic reality. So yeah, I think we need to be more flexible than that. But at the same time, I think that is a really massive hint. I think that we do see things like Zionism, and we do see things like religious identity in general as functions and as, in a way, products of economic reality, some of which I just mentioned, right? So yeah, I think that it's sort of impossible to understand this issue without looking at how all of these issues of identity have profit motives in a way behind them, perpetuating them. So one way, Marx's approach is really to kind of ignore religious identity and let it do its thing, and instead really focus on ameliorating economic problems, and through that we could heal the cause of the problem. So you can imagine a world in a one democratic state where everyone has their basic needs met as a right and not a privilege, and everyone's living in basic equality, and there aren't really economic issues. What really would people have to fight about? Like, yes, maybe there would be residuals of racism and residuals of animosity after all of this violence. I think that, like, we have to be realistic here. One of the things Marx always talks about is we have to work with the society that's given to us and not try to create idealistic frameworks of like utopic societies or something and just try to create them. No, we have to work with the situation that is given to us. And so, yeah, we have to recognize that there's going to be racial tensions and stuff, but one of the most important and foundational ways to address that is by ensuring everyone equal rights and ensuring everyone the ability to survive. That means economic rights, right? We want not just a political bill of rights that ensures equality. We want economic rights, and if we can do that, then it doesn't seem like there's going to be that much to fight about. I mean, everyone in a one democratic state would be able to travel to wherever they want, to be able to live where they want if they're not kicking anybody else out. Like, I don't see a real need for violence if these issues are dealt with. And Marxism is a framework that helps us, identify that.
Thank you. I think you might have partially answered my next question with all of this, or let's say it might be the negation or the other side of the coin of what you just said. So you talked before about the ethnocentric states. We are talking now about identities. We frame it more as the politicization of identities. So I will talk more about this. From the perspective of Marxism, why are identities politicized? Is there a relation with capitalism, and which one?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know what more I can say about the reasons why identities are politicized other than by looking at some of the interests that people have in creating those structures. And those interests the first place to look when you look at that is to look at the profit incentive, for sure. So that's that. But your question also kind of makes me think about the politicization of identity. And what I'd like to do, with your permission, is to kind of compare the sort of one democratic state approach to that, which is the complete depoliticization of identity, and say you can believe what you want to believe, but that doesn't give you special political rights, especially not to oppress anybody else or kick anybody else out, versus the two-state solution. And I should always do in quotations, right? The two-state solution and their approach to identity politics. Well, yeah, what I want to do is maybe say a few words about the history of this idea of splitting up identities into two or more different nation states. Well, that idea goes all the way back to the origins of the nation state system. And in international relations, scholars tend to pinpoint the origin of that idea back to the Westphalian Peace Treaty. And I shouldn't really say origins. I'm kind of, in some way, I'm like a good Foucauldian, like Michel Foucault, who his genealogical method opposes itself to the search for origins. So we can think about the Westphalian Peace Treaty as a punctuation point, right? As in the development of this desire to separate identities across hard borders. So the Westphalian Peace Treaty is something that was the conclusion or the end of the 30 Years' War in Europe from 1618 to 1648. It was one of the longest and one of the most brutal European wars. It was between the Catholics and the Lutherans and the Calvinists, and they were arguing over how to govern despite deep religious differences. It was a problem of difference that they were reckoning with, religious difference. And the solution that they came to was to create different nation states where each one could be governed by a different religion. Each nation state could kind of be a different religion. And so the politicization of identity was maintained and codified into sovereign nation states in that moment. There's a great book about this written actually by my professor. His name is Naim Inayatullah, and his co-author David Blaney. It's called The Problem of Difference. It's just super relevant to this, and they talk a little bit about Israel and Palestine. And yeah, just a nice shout out. I hope you read that book. He says that the critique or the standard narrative is that this was a solution to the problem of difference. You separate people across hard borders, and that's sort of it. You know, you can dust your hands off and call it a day. Well, the critique, I think, from these scholars, my professors, is that they call it a deferral of the problem of difference. It wasn't a real reckoning with religious difference or difference of any kind. They just deferred this problem across state borders. And in fact, there were many more wars between these religious states afterwards, because now they had their own standing armies, right? Now, and you can see this issue coming to the fore, this could be one major problem with the two-state solution in Israel and Palestine is, imagine you separate them into two different nation states, and now you've got a situation where two groups are kicking everybody out that doesn't belong in that group, and they're not sharing their shared holy land. It's like one group gets half, the other group gets half. I mean, it's not half and half. It never was going to be half and half exactly, but they each get their different parts. And now you're just it's like this is not sharing. People have a right to go and live in connection with their home holy land, wherever it is. And so those hard borders would really be a cleavage, a separation of that. And we see glimmers of that, today, even though there's not two states. But what would happen with two states is then you would have two legitimate standing militaries, which Palestine doesn't have right now. And Israel is going to burn the region to the ground before it lets Palestine have a standing military of its own. And I think that I think there's a lot of empirical evidence to indicate that. So yeah. Anyway, so what's the solution? The solution, I think, is to not defer the problem of difference. And I think it's critical to find ways of depoliticizing identity. So, for example, secularism is kind of the answer here, that religion shouldn't control governance because it produces things like Jewish supremacy or any other kind of supremacy, Christian supremacy, Islamic supremacy. So we have to move out of that framework entirely. And yeah, that means we have to move past Zionism. We have to move past the Zionist entity entirely. And along with that, Hamas, as I mentioned, for the reasons I mentioned.
Thank you. We were wondering in the preparation of this call if you had something to say regarding a potential anarchist proposition of no state solution. And what do you think of no state versus one state?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do have some things to say about. I do have some things to say about this, but there's some things coming to mind right now about the two-state solution. So maybe, if with your permission, I could talk a little bit more about the two-state idea, and then I could go into this other idea about the no-state solution, because that is a particularly annoying issue for me, and I want I want to say something about it. Okay, so I mean, I should say also, I defer to your analysis about the two-state idea, but my feeling is that despite virtually insurmountable empirical obstacles, some of which I just mentioned, it's not theoretically impossible to have a two-state solution. Like the Westphalian peace settlements, I don't see a reason why it's completely impossible in theory. And I'd put that question to you. I'd love to hear if you do have an idea, like a theoretical barrier to the two-state solution, even though there are, like I just said, like a litany of empirical obstacles that make it incredibly difficult for something like that to, in reality, come into effect. But in theory, I don't see a problem with it. But what I do see is that in practice, no two-state settlement, even if it could be reached, which I don't think it really will, if it was, hypothetically, no two-state solution could ever be in accordance with international law as it stands, unless Israel succeeds in killing or cleansing millions of Palestinians. I mean, not even just cleansing, it would need to murder millions of Palestinians in order for it to eventually, years and years down the line, be in accordance with international law. Why? Well, what am I talking about here? Well, the two-state solution is a form of Zionism. Yeah, we should just put that out there, and everyone should know that and get a tattoo of that says the two-state solution is Zionism. And it has a fundamental problem, and the problem is called the demographic problem. So inside Greater Israel, and that includes the occupied territories, the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, there are approximately 7.3 million Palestinians and about the same amount, 7.3 million Israelis. And around the world, there have been 7 million Palestinian refugees since the creation of Israel. So part of international law says that Palestinians have a right to return to the land that they've been ethnically cleansed from. Yeah, that's a law. You ethnically cleanse people, it's a crime. Yeah, and the smoking gun of ethnic cleansing is that they haven't been invited back. So Israel does a thing where they'll kick people out of their homes and they'll say, this is an ethnic cleansing, you're going to be allowed back. Well, until they're allowed back, it is ethnic cleansing. So the problem is, if Israel ever did this, if Israel ever allowed them back and ensured their right of return, then Israel's Jewish voting majority would be threatened. And Israel's constitution as a Zionist state relies on maintaining that Jewish majority. So it can never allow this aspect of international law to be implemented. It really relies fundamentally on crimes against humanity, whether or not it grants a Palestinian state. So to my mind, Israel has to be dismantled. The Zionist entity has to be dismantled because it's fundamentally anathema to international law because of what's called the demographic problem. So yeah, in practice, maybe it's possible, in theory rather, to do a two-state solution, but in theory, I mean, logically speaking, there's no way for an Israeli state to exist, even alongside a Palestinian state that's in accordance with international law, unless it exterminates masses of Palestinians, which we cannot allow to happen. Okay, so I thank you. I just needed to say that thing about the two-state solution here before we can talk about the no-state solution, which I've got a question for the no-state solution people. Or the question that I should say they have to answer is, what's their actual plan? What's your plan to have this anarchist and no state solution? Or are you just saying nice slogans that sound really good, but basically detract from realistic paths to justice? I mean, why are there no academics talking about this or offering serious descriptions of a path to a no state solution that doesn't first go through a one state solution? Take an example, right? Noam Chomsky, world's greatest anarchist thinker, probably. He says, no one but punks and fringe academics think that we can just dissolve the state immediately, without a plan to replace it with something. And this is not a strategy, he says, and he's right. So yeah, my question for the no state solution people is, what's your plan? Because the Marxists have a plan, right? They've been talking about this for a very long time, and they have something to say about this, about how to dialectically overcome the state, and their ideas are pretty clear. So how do we use dialectics to overcome the state? Well, the concept here is a German one called Aufhebung. Yeah, Aufhebung can be translated as sublation, which is, there's a nice dialectical tension in this idea between preserving the previous stage and transcending that previous stage. And I kind of hate to say this, but the best Marxist to read about this is actually an Israeli Zionist who's dead now. His name is Shlomo Aviniri. And we should reject his Zionist ideas, but I think we should seriously engage with his version of Marxism. Anyway, in his book, which is called The Social and Political Thought of Karl Marx, he talks about what's the mechanism for dialectically overcoming the state. And in a word, he says it's universal suffrage. This is the means by which the state will be overcome, through suffrage, through fixing the wound of democracy. And it's not just giving everybody the right to vote. It's about creating a radical democracy that is truly representative of its people, and only through that moment, through that process of really representing everyone's wills, can the state be overcome. So, and this has a real basis in Marxism. Marx's co-author Friedrich Engels, in his book Anti-Düring, describes this process by which the state will be overcome. He talks about the withering away of the state. I've got a quote here I could read you because I think it's pretty good. It's really famous. He says, quote, "The interference of the state power in social relations becomes superfluous in one sphere after another, and then ceases of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and the direction of the process of production. So the state is not abolished, it withers away." So that's a very famous and highly fraught and controversial statement, but I would put that, I think it's basically right, and I think I would put that to the no state solution people, which is that, yeah, the state is not abolished, it withers away, it's rendered superfluous. So we don't just abolish the state, we organize our way out of it. How does this happen? Like I said, Aveniri talks about universal suffrage, but that doesn't just mean giving everyone the vote. That's really important, but it really means, like I was saying, it means fixing democracy and making it work at all levels. The example that's given at that time, the best example available to Marx, was the Paris Commune in 1871. You're French, right? There you go. Well, there you go. Paris Commune.
Yes, yes.
1871. Yeah. So it wasn't exactly universal suffrage. I mean, women weren't allowed to vote in that experiment, but all public officials were subject to popular recall in regular elections. It really was a highly democratic organization. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you how to fix democracy at every level. I don't have the plan for that, and Marx doesn't either. He says socialists should avoid writing recipes for the cookshops of the future. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just saying that this is something that's going to have to be worked out over time in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places. But when and if we do perfect democracy, specifically democracy in the economy, then, and I should say something about that. I mean, we're not just talking about political democracy, economic democracy, which is, the economy is where we spend most of our lives, 8 hours a day or whatever. We're at a job that's not democratic. Most of us, we work within a hierarchy. We work for a boss. So yeah, economic democracy is either nationalization or workers, self-directed enterprises, co-ops, communes, cooperatives of some kind. Healing that wound of economic democracy is also going to be a precondition for the abolition of the state. And where is that movement in Israel? What are the no-state solution people have to say about that? Like what? I mean, besides maybe the kibbutzim or something like that. I mean, it's not really a real, vibrant movement that would be able to create an organization or a series of organizations, whether it's cooperatives or syndicates of cooperatives, that's going to represent a real alternative to state organization, to state centralization. So it's just not there. I mean, as far as I can see, and that's the reason why you don't see any academic scholars talking about this right now. So, yeah, I mean, the key here is that we need to organize ourselves effectively and render the state unnecessary. If Aufhebung is about preserving and transcending, then we transcend the hierarchy of the state, but we preserve the organization of society. Remember the symbol of the anarchists, like the A with the circle around it? Well, that's not a circle, it's an O, and the O stands for order. Anarchy is order. That's a famous anarchist paradox promoted by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, another French guy. There you go. So, yeah. So that's the way we do it, right? And yeah, I just really want to highlight that. I mean, anarchy is order. Zionism is chaos. But I want to be fair to the no-state solution individuals that I've had some good engagements with, because they'll say that we don't need to go through a state stage in all cases and in all times. Like this argument is really, in effect, a defense against, a defense of genocide, or it's a defense, against genocide. If it were true that every group of people had to go through the same linear development of like not having a state and then having a state and then moving into a sort of socialist state and then having a no state version of communism / anarchism, and that's the universal progression of history across times and across space, then this would really justify the destruction of indigenous groups, right? And so that's a real problem, and I see where they're coming from in that way. But yeah, I mean, I really accept that. I just want to say that there is no such indigenous group in Israel. There's not even a real leftist movement in Israel. So this argument doesn't apply in this case. And yeah, I think we all just have to deal with that. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about that.
Thank you. No, that's really insightful, especially because I don't think this is something that we hear a lot, or that is out there a lot. You've mentioned a few times a socialist state. I wanted to ask you how you envision the one democratic state, and would it be a socialist state?
Nice. Yeah, that's a great question. Let me answer that question, but I want to back up here because another thing I want to talk about regarding this issue of universal suffrage, right? That was Aveniri, the Zionist Marxist guy I was on about. There's other people that talk about universal suffrage as a form of moving into a sort of stateless situation in an ethical and gradual way. But there's a Palestinian author who I love, Ghada Karmi. That's Ghada Karmi, Karmi. Her book One State is really great, and her ideas are quite similar to Aveniri's because she also talks about the importance of suffrage, and she basically says the way to peacefully move to a one-state solution is to give everyone the vote inside of Greater Israel. And like I was saying, because of this demographic problem that we sort of described, Zionism wouldn't be allowed to persist if everyone had the vote inside of Greater Israel, because yeah, Zionism relies on a Jewish voting majority, and that majority wouldn't exist if everyone had the right to vote. So I think we could really frame the struggle in that way, as a simple like call for universal suffrage. If everyone simply had the vote, Zionism would crumble. It would kind of naturally die out. I mean, there's other ways to do that, to expedite that process, but in some ways it could be as simple as that. So, I mean, I take your question as like a, do we fight for a socialist solution, or do we fight for a bourgeois, democratic, liberal state? Like, what kind of a one state are we trying to create? And yeah, I mean, I hope I understand that question. And if I do, then my response is that we'll take what we can get. I think if a capitalist state comes about in Palestine that provides a modicum of equality to these people, then that's a massive step in the right direction, if you ask me. And then the Palestinians would be in the exact same position that the rest of the world is in right now, which is waging a socialist struggle against a capitalist democracy. So if that's the only option that's available to us, and a socialist state that has an economic bill of rights that ensures economic rights to people isn't really on the table, then okay, like that's not great, but it's better than, I mean, it's obviously miles better than the situation that we see right now. So, I mean, it's way better than any kind of two-state solution where there's two different groups kicking each other out of a shared holy land. So, yeah, if you're asking me if I'm in support of some kind of economic bill of rights in Palestine, yeah, I am. I think it should be socialist, but I think we need to be realistic and take what we can get. The phrase here, the famous phrase is that we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? So yeah, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Thank you. Well, in relation to that, how do you position yourself, or how do you position yourself in the discussion on the future of Palestine as a non-Palestinian? And do you think that this discussion should or can include non-Palestinians?
Yeah, well, my entry point to this conflict is not as an outsider. I mean, obviously, I'm not a Palestinian, but yeah, it's my country. I'm an American. My country is funding a genocide that's ongoing, and my tax dollars are paying for it. So it's really wrong. I mean, maybe this is the dialectician inside of me that sees the interconnection between all things, but I'm connected to this issue. I'm culpable. I'm on the wrong side of this issue in many ways. So what I try to do, my basic approach is to look into Palestinian voices, right? Anytime I'm in a situation, right, where I'm engaging in international politics, I try to find voices of oppressed individuals and ally myself with them. And that's exactly what I'm doing in this situation. I see Palestinians like Gada Karmi, who I just mentioned, and I just try to amplify their voices, to the best of my ability within the scope of the frameworks that I understand and my ideas about what peace and justice would look like. So, yeah. But one thing one thing I should really point out is that Palestinians don't speak with a monolithic voice, right? They're not just one people. There's a lot of disagreement, and that has been exemplified over time, and even right now there's a lot of disagreement. Although I have to say I was really happy to learn that ODSI, your organization, got 20,000 signatures from Palestinians in support. So I just, snaps for that. That's really awesome. And I'm happy to try to ally myself with those individuals. But yeah, there's also a lot of problematic things going on in Palestine right now. And what's coming to me right now that I'd like to speak about is, it's kind of a corollary issue, but I just want to address something that I hear a lot of Zionists talk about, which is the the corruption of Hamas, right? Hamas is a Palestinian organization, and to what degree am I allying myself with Hamas you know, as if there's massive class divisions between Hamas and like ordinary Palestinians, and I'm definitely not an expert in Hamas, but I have seen reports of like Hamas, like something that came up, and someone asked me to talk about this. Is I saw reports of Hamas stealing food from Palestinians, from civilians, and so how do I respond to that? Well, first of all, let me just say that every army that has ever been in a desperate situation has stolen from and exploited the civilians that they're supposed to protect. So that's what men with guns do. If it's a problem with Hamas, it's a problem that's not unique to Hamas. And I'm fully willing to problematize Hamas in all these ways, but I really think we need to put this like in context, that this is an organization whose main mandate is to heal this wound of Zionism, to resist Zionism by any means at its disposal, which is its right to do, by the way. If we look at international law, it's very clear that occupied people, and Gaza is an occupied people, since 1967, there's wall-to-wall international agreement that Gaza is an occupied territory and still is. That means that they have a right to resist, according to the United Nations, and they have a right to resist, quote, by any means at their disposal. So that gives them quite a lot of leeway to resist and to use violence to resist occupation. So anyway, that doesn't excuse or whatever. That doesn't excuse them taking advantage of the desperation of the people that they're supposed to represent. But yeah, I mean, I just don't get this picture of Hamas as a super hierarchical organization that is separated from Palestinians and is exploiting Palestinians and stealing their food aid to the best of their ability. I see them as someone who says that there is no liberation of Palestinians without ending Israeli occupation, and all of Israel is an occupation. The whole of the Zionist entity is an occupation. So their mandate is to fight against the Zionist entity, and I support that endeavor. I mean, what I should say is that I believe Palestinians have a right to resist, as they do according to international law. I have heard reports of Hamas stealing food aid from Palestinians, and I mean, it's insane and wrong to suggest that that's the reason why Palestinians are starving right now, and not that Israel's not letting any food aid in, or when it does let the tiny bit of food aid in, it then bombs that region and destroys it immediately afterwards or whatever. I mean, these are facts that I'm talking about. So it's really ridiculous to blame Hamas for any level of starvation in Gaza before or after October 7th. So I don't know what, I mean, the thing I was about to say was that we all saw Yahya Sinwar's death, right? And he didn't seem like the kind of champagne sipping Hamas leaders that Zionists made him out to be. I mean, Hamas is experiencing the same extermination campaign that Palestinians are experiencing. And if they're stealing food aid from Palestinians, from civilians, from time to time, I mean, we should just see that as something that goes on when there are men that have guns and civilians that don't. Across the board, in desperate situations, soldiers have taken advantage of civilians. So yeah, we get to problematize them for that, but it's really the height of absurdity to blame the suffering going on in Gaza on Hamas right now. Like I was trying to explain, that Hamas's main mandate is to fight against the Zionist entity, because there just can't be peace for Palestinians while there's a Zionist entity there. And hopefully that has become clear over some of the other things that I've said today. So their mandate is to fight against Israel, and I support their right to do so because it's enshrined in international law. I mean, I could even find it for you right here. I actually have it up here. let me find it so I can save to the people exactly what law I'm talking about here. This is um, resolution, UN resolution 2621, that says that occupied people have a right to resist by any means at their disposal. So all I'm saying is I recognize that right. And Israel has no right to defend itself from the people it occupies. It doesn't have a right to exist, let alone attack the people that it occupies. It has responsibilities to them. So we live in a topsy-turvy world regarding international law and who has a right to defend itself, who has a right to resist. Palestinians have a right to resist. I hope that answered your. I'm not sure if I addressed your question. Did I get to any of it?
You did, and then you addressed other points, which are also really interesting on the role of Hamas. So, and yes, you did address my question. So, to move towards the conclusion, how does talking about Palestine on your platform has affected your work, so positively or negatively, and did you see an impact?
Well, I mean, I should be frank right now that I could maybe show you some numbers that indicate that I've like gained like Instagram followers because of some of the pro-Palestinian content that I've created. So I could be upfront about that, but that's true about pretty much any activist who's trying to do things. So yeah, I mean, I haven't made any like money about this. Maybe it's important to be upfront about this. But I've made a lot of enemies for sure. And that makes me think about that Oscar Wilde's quote that says you can judge a person by the quality of their enemies. Well, I'm trying to choose my enemies quite carefully here, and I'm pretty satisfied with what I've done. So I've made no money. I've gained some followers, and, and I've made a lot of enemies, but maybe some allies too. So I don't know. Does that help? Does that answer your question? What
Yes,
impact?
that's interesting. And it's actually interesting that despite the censorship that we see on social media, the like the platform, like content creators that post content about Palestine do gain like views and followers and do have a platform on this.
You asked another. You
Yeah,
asked
sorry.
another
Yeah, I
question.
asked about the impact, but also I was curious to know if through your work as a teacher, you have the possibility of also talking about Palestine.
Yeah, well, I can not really. The answer to that is no, not really. The venue that I have to speak out about Palestine is really my like social media accounts right now. I make short videos that are supposed to be educational and helpful. And so yeah, that's really where I do that. But I am working on an online course that's an introduction to Marxism course that I hope people take because the principles that I outline in that course are highly applicable to international politics, particularly Israel and Palestine. Although I should say Marxism doesn't really have that much to say about, like if we're talking about what are the limitations of Marxism, Marxism doesn't really have that much to say about the mass extermination campaigns that are going on right now. I mean, it really, where it shines is talking about labor exploitation and flows of capital. So it has a lot to say about that, but it doesn't really help us adjudicate international law that much. So I don't know. That's one limitation about Marxism. But yeah, I mean, in terms of where I teach, I'm doing an online course that it's been 2 years in the making, and hopefully the first installment of that will be released pretty soon. So stay tuned for that because I think the dialectical philosophy I'm talking about there is going to be applicable. It is applicable to this, so I think it'll help.
Okay, thank you so much. And yes, so in terms of impact, is it something that you have noticed directly or not?
No, no, definitely not. I don't think that I'm making any impact at all. But I think that collectively there is a shift that's going on right now. And what came to mind for me was actually a third law in dialectics, which is the law of the transformation of quality into quantity and vice versa. So let me explain that really quickly. I think, and so the idea is that as quantities change, they reach a tipping point in which the quality will also change as well. So the example is water. You could take an example from natural science, water. As the quantitative temperature of water changes, its qualitative state of matter will change from ice to water to liquid to gas, and so there are these tipping points, these punctuation points that dialectics talks about. And yeah, what's not, I'm not a Leninist, but there is a nice quote from Vladimir Lenin that goes, there are decades when nothing happens, and weeks when decades happen. Yeah, decades when nothing happens, and weeks when decades happen. And that idea was that as these social movements, as revolutionary sentiment foments, then there are these short periods of time when a lot can change. And I think that unfortunately, the quantitative scope, or the quantitative dimension that is applicable here is human suffering, is death tolls, is injury tolls, is the numbers of people that have been ethnically cleansed from the land. And I heard ODSI say recently that we shouldn't talk about ethnic cleansing, we should talk about ethnic raising, because cleansing has a positive connotation and raising is a lot more applicable in that sense. And I think that's basically right. So anyway, as these quantitative dimensions become worse and worse and worse, qualitative shifts are bound to happen. That's the lesson of dialectics. So I think that there are tipping points here, and this situation is unsustainable, and that which is unsustainable cannot last. So there's possibly a ray of hope there.
Thank you. I think it's a very interesting framework to look at this. And I also agree that we are seeing a shift in the way people speak about Palestine, not only in the quantity, but also in the messages, and in making more space for Palestinian voices and speaking more about, well, liberation from the river to the sea. This is something that 10 years ago people were not saying, even Palestinian supporters. One state solution was something that was present, but it was not publicized in the same way, or less people were defending it. So yeah, there is definitely a shift, and it's an interesting way to look at it. To finish a little bit, I wanted to ask you if there are messages that either you don't have the opportunity to share otherwise, or that you share but you think is really important to highlight here, that you want to use this this interview to share them.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yes, there are. And I, in my heart, I'm speaking to some of my lost Zionist friends here, but also just Zionists that I've heard talk about Israel as a decolonization campaign. And they point to the Arab conquests in the 7th century to try to claim that Palestinians are somehow foreigners. Well, I'm not going to go into the whole history of the Arab conquest in the 7th century or whatever, but I just want to say that Palestinian ancestry does go back as far as we can trace, back to the Bronze Age, back to the Canaanites, before the biblical kingdoms of Israel and all that. So Palestinian people have ancestry that goes all the way back. And I think that's true for many Jews as well. I think we need to recognize that. So the question of who was there first really is kind of the wrong question when both groups can trace ancestry back thousands of years to that place. So the real question ought to be about what political structures we can allow that let everyone live in their shared Holy Land in peace and justice and equality. And that's not the two-state solution, right? The two-state solution is a cleavage that separates people from aspects of their Holy Land. And it doesn't even matter if it's their Holy Land. I mean, I'm like basically an anarchist who thinks that people should have a right to go and live and be wherever they want to, whether they have some ancestry there or some religious connection there or not. The only condition to that would be don't kick anybody else off of the land so that you can. And that's exactly the situation that we're seeing with Israel. So yeah, that would be one major thing I would like to sort of point out, that there's really no sense that Israel is a decolonization campaign. That's just not accurate.
Yeah, that hurts a bit to hear something like this as somebody who studied decolonization and decolonial research in general. That's very hurtful.
That's what
Okay,
we're
thank
dealing
you.
with, though. You know, people recognize this for sure. That's absolutely the things that people say. I do have something else that's coming to mind. There's kind of two other like broad points. If you've got a minute, I would like to say two sort of concluding points here. One thing is that I think a lot of Zionists avoid critiquing Israel because, by critiquing Iran, right? They say, well, and to be sure, Iran has a lot of serious problems that we need to engage with, right? We need to ally ourselves with the women's struggle in Iran, for sure. But the crimes of Iran do not justify the crimes of Israel, and they don't justify what's happening in Palestine. It's not like if we didn't support Israel, then Iran would take over, right? Iran is not the cause of the violence that we're seeing in this region. There's just no evidence for this. In fact, you know, there's a lot of evidence to show that Iran's Islamic fundamentalism has always drawn support through its resistance to US imperialism, to Western imperialism. And yes, Israel is a manifestation of US imperialism. So if you're really concerned about Iran's fundamentalism, then you should be interested in taking away Iran's major source of support, which is its resistance to Israeli crimes. So these two issues go together, I think. You can't just shame Iran and ignore your own crimes. Healing one really requires healing the other. That's one thing I wanted to say kind of about Iran, because that's quite annoying to see. But the other thing that's also quite annoying to hear is that this idea that Israel is the only thing that's keeping Jews safe. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole history of how Zionism has allied itself with anti-Semitism from the very beginning and used that to create anti-Semitism, to create this picture that Israel is the only place where Jews can be safe. But actually, the deeper point here is that you don't need to oppress other people in order to be safe. And in fact, violence begets violence. So the fundamental structures of violence that continue to reproduce violence here are Israeli occupation. So the foundation of which is Zionism. It's resulting in genocide, and the two-state solution is Zionism. Let's all get that tattooed. Okay,
Thank
that's
you.
it. That's what I
Yes,
got.
I just wanted to react briefly to these two last points because I think they're really important. On the fact that your last point on the fact that Israel would be the only safe place for Jews, I think that this is a recognition by Western states that Jews are not safe in their own countries, and that instead of dealing with this problem, they would rather defend Israel. So this is something that is often not acknowledged, but this is what's behind this is this issue. And on the association between anti-Zionism and being pro-Iran, I think this is something that, like, I find it in both ways, meaning that I find people who would not want to critique Israel because they say that this is supporting Iran, and I see people who would say that critiquing Iran is supporting Israel. And I think that making space for complexity in our opinions and going away from this idea that the enemy of my enemy is my ally, like this is an effort that we need to do across the board, including within pro-Palestinian movements, to leave space for voices that are different. Yeah, some people might be pro-Iran and you might be against what Iran is doing on some levels. That's okay, but this is disconnected from the pro-Palestinian movement. So I think this is a message that is lacking, and it's good that you mentioned it, that it's not because not going against the Zionist projects doesn't mean supporting a state that is extremely problematic for its own citizens, first and foremost. So yeah, that's
It's a
thank you for
bizarre
this.
situation. I mean, yeah, as problematic as Iran is, it is one of the only states that is doing its duty in terms of using force to intervene and stop an ongoing genocide. So it's this crazy situation where, yeah, it's a highly problematic state that we need to resist. It's an ethnocentric state too. You know, it's a problematic organization. It doesn't rest on crimes against humanity, right, in the way that Israel does. It's different. And there's an order of operations with which we can address these two different ethnocentric states. One of them is actively engaged in genocide, and can't exist without crimes against humanity. But on the other hand, Iran is sort of doing its duty. You know, it's duty according to international law to intervene. And so, you know, on one hand, we kind of have to support that, and on the other hand, we've got to critique them. So, yeah, nuance
Yeah.
is key, as you say.
Yeah, exactly. Like country is not, it's not only its external relations and it's not only its internal affairs. It's both coexist. So yeah, thank you. Maybe just before we finish, do you have a message that you would like to share to Palestinians?
No, no, not without getting emotional, I think. I mean, what can what is there to say? I hope that you survive. Um, I hope that you survive.